Lyrian had known exile was coming long before they spoke the words. She had seen it in their eyes, the quiet judgment, the averted gazes, the way people whispered her name like it was already fading from existence. She had tried to tell herself that she could still belong, that she could still be useful, but deep down she had always known the truth. She was a widow without a bond, a woman who had survived when she should not have. They made their decision in silence, as was tradition among the Varen. There were no accusations, no raised voices, just the high elders standing before her in their flowing ceremonial robes, their luminous silver eyes void of warmth. "You are to leave." 3 words, no trial, no appeal. She had pleaded, not for herself but for her son. He was innocent, he did not deserve this. "His fate is yours to bear," the elders had said. And that was the end of it. They had given her only what she could carry, a small ration pack, a thermal blanket, a knife that was more ceremonial than practical, and a single fire starter. Then they led her to the transport bay, where the cold, clinical halls of Varel Prime ended and the vast darkness of the void awaited. She hadn't fought as they escorted her onto the shuttle. There was no point. Fighting would only prove them right. The ship had launched without ceremony, a single streak of light vanishing into the abyss. She had cradled her son as they descended, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Then the hatch had opened, and the cold had swallowed them whole. The wind shrieked through the empty landscape, a relentless force that sliced through flesh and bone. Lyrian huddled closer to the meager fire she had built, shielding it from the icy gusts with her trembling hands. The flames crackled weakly, their golden glow barely strong enough to hold back the night. Her son lay curled beside her, wrapped in the tattered remains of her cloak. His small chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his green skin tinged a worrying shade of gray. Too cold, too weak. Lyrian tightened her grip on the fabric around him, her fingers aching from the frost. She had nothing left to give him. No more blankets, no more food. The rations had run out yesterday, and she had burned every scrap of cloth she could spare. But it wasn't enough. She glanced down at herself. Her thin tunic clung to her body, the fabric stiff with frost. She had nothing else to burn. Unless her hands shook as she reached for the hem of her tunic. The fabric was lightweight, meant for the warm corridors of Varel Prime, not the frozen wasteland of this forsaken planet. But it would burn. It would keep the fire alive a little longer. She pulled the knife from her belt, the metal so cold it burned her fingers, and began slicing away strips of cloth. The fire hissed as she fed it, the flames devouring the offering greedily. Heat surged, just enough to bring a hint of color back to her son's cheeks. She exhaled, relief mixing with despair. This fire wouldn't last long, and when it died, there would be nothing left. She pulled her son closer, pressing her lips to his forehead. His skin was still too cold. "Stay with me, little one," she whispered. His small fingers twitched, his voice barely a whisper. "Mama? Warm?" Lyrian closed her eyes against the sting of tears. "Yes," she lied, "warm." A gust of wind howled through the darkness, and the fire wavered. She reached for another strip of fabric, but before she could cut it, a shadow moved beyond the firelight. Lyrian froze. At first she thought it was the wind playing tricks on her, but then she saw it again. A tall figure, half hidden by the swirling snow. Her heart pounded. A raider? No. They wouldn't waste their time on a dying exile. A beast? No. It moved with too much purpose. Then the figure stepped closer, and she saw it. The thick furs, the heavy boots, the unmistakable presence of something alien. A human. She recoiled instinctively, wrapping herself tighter around her son. Humans were dangerous, that was what she had been taught. uncivilized, violent, incapable of restraint. They were nothing more than a primal species that thrived on war. She had never seen one in person. Until now. The human stopped a few feet away, watching her through the storm. His dark hair was dusted with frost, his breath a steady plume of mist in the freezing air. He was enormous, his broad frame wrapped in layers of heavy fur. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he reached up and unfastened his coat. Liren tensed. She had expected a weapon. A blade, a gun, something to confirm everything she had been told about his kind. But instead, he pulled off his thick outer coat and extended it toward her. She flinched. He was offering it to her. She hesitated, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Accepting help from a human was unthinkable, but the fire was dying, and her son was slipping away. Her fingers shook as she reached for the coat. Their hands brushed just for an instant, and a strange heat lingered on her skin, a warmth that was not just physical. She quickly wrapped the coat around her child, pulling him close, his small body curled into the warmth instinctively. The human watched her for a moment longer, then crouched near the fire, his sharp eyes scanning her stripped-down tunic, the remnants of fabric in the flames. "You burned your clothes to keep him warm," he said. His voice was deep, rough, but not unkind. She didn't answer. She couldn't. He exhaled, his breath misting in the cold. "You'll die like this." Lyrian stiffened. She already knew that. But when he spoke again, there was something else in his voice, something that made her pulse quicken with unease. "You have two choices," he said. "Stay here and freeze." The fire crackled between them, a dying heartbeat in the vast silence. "Or come with me." She fidgeted in slow, stiff movements, tightening the coat on her child before standing up. Her legs trembled beneath her. She almost gave up, but forced herself to stand upright. Even now, she did not look weak. The human was watching her intently, his expression unreadable. "I'll go with you," he finally said, his words tasting of defeat. Something relaxed in his posture, but only a little. He nodded once. "Oh." Lyrian hesitated before lifting his chin. "But if you try to hurt my son, I will kill you." For the first time, the human's lips curled into something that could be amusing. "Okay." The cold never truly left her. Even wrapped in the heavy human coat, Lyrian felt the frost biting at her bones, sinking deep beneath her skin. Her muscles ached, stiff with exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep moving. The man, Daniel, walked ahead of her, cutting a steady path through the deep snow. He hadn't said much since she'd accepted his offer, only pausing every so often to glance back at her and the child she carried. She didn't trust him, but trust had no place in survival. He had warmth, shelter, protection, and right now those things mattered more than her fear. She kept her son bundled against her chest, listening to the faint rhythm of his breathing. Still too shallow, still too weak. The fire had helped, but not enough. She needed real warmth, not the fleeting heat of burning fabric and desperation. Ahead, Daniel came to a stop. The wind howled around them, tugging at his fur-lined hood as he surveyed the terrain. Lyrian followed his gaze, spotting a dark shape rising from the snow a short distance away. At first, it looked like just another jagged formation of ice, but as they drew closer, she saw it metal. The broken remains of a structure, half buried beneath layers of frost. "An old research outpost," Daniel said, his voice gruff. "Or what's left of one." Lyrian hesitated. The ruins were unstable, the roof barely visible beneath a thick crust of ice. But it was shelter, and they had no other choice. Daniel moved first, testing the entrance with careful steps. When the ice held, he gestured for her to follow. Lyrian clutched her son tighter and stepped inside. The space was small, little more than a husk of whatever it had once been. Walls of dark metal curved around them, the ceiling cracked open in places where time and weather had taken their toll. Snow had piled in drifts along the edges, but the center was relatively clear. More importantly, it blocked the wind. Daniel dropped his pack and crouched near the remains of an old workstation. He reached inside his coat, pulling free a bundle of kindling and a small, battered fire starter, the same kind she had been given before her exile. A single spark, barely enough to last a night. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, setting to work. Lyrian didn't answer right away. She moved to a far wall, lowering herself carefully onto the frozen floor. Her son stirred weakly in her arms, shifting as she tucked him deeper into the human's coat. 3 days, she said finally. Daniel didn't look up. "You wouldn't have lasted 4. She bristled at his tone, but she couldn't argue. She had known it too. The fire flared to life, a small flickering glow in the dim ruin. Lyrian edged closer, holding her hands out toward the warmth. Her fingers were numb, her nails tinged with a faint blue. Her son stirred again. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing tired, unfocused violet eyes. He turned his head slightly, taking in their surroundings before settling his gaze on Danielle. "Mama, whom?" the child mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyrian stiffened. She had taught him the word long ago, back when she had never expected to see one with her own eyes, a word spoken in warning, in hushed tones among her people. But her son was too young for fear. His small, chilled fingers curled into the thick coat Daniel had given them. Daniel let out a low breath. "I guess that's me," he muttered. Lyrian felt something tighten in her chest, something close to unease. He wasn't what she had expected. He should have been cruder, more violent, more like the stories she had been told, but so far he had done nothing but offer help. That didn't mean she trusted him. A deep rumble shook the walls. Lyrian went rigid. It wasn't the wind. Daniel reacted instantly, pulling a long, jagged knife from his belt as he rose to his feet. Lyrian tensed, every muscle in her body screaming at her to move. The sound came again, closer this time. A heavy, dragging noise, something large shifting through the snow just outside their fragile shelter. Daniel glanced at her. "Stay here." She didn't argue. She wrapped herself around her son, pressing him close as Daniel moved toward the entrance. The creature struck before he made it outside. A blur of motion, a massive shape bursting through the entrance in a spray of ice and snow. The firelight caught the gleam of thick mottled fur, the flash of curved talons. A tundra beast. Lyrian had seen them before. Massive predators built for this frozen hell, with jaws strong enough to crush bone. Daniel barely had time to react before it lunged. Lyrian's breath caught as he twisted aside, his movements fast despite the weight of his furs. The creature snarled, its bulk slamming against the metal wall with a force that made the entire structure shudder. Daniel moved with brutal efficiency. His knife flashed, burying deep into the beast's shoulder. It let out a furious, bone-rattling screech, but Daniel didn't hesitate. He drove the blade deeper, wrenching it free in a spray of dark, steaming blood. The beast staggered, letting out a final, pained growl before it collapsed. Silence fell. Lyrian barely realized she had been holding her breath. Daniel exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders as he wiped the blood from his blade. He glanced over at her, expression unreadable. She forced herself to meet his gaze. That was... She searched for the right word, something to mask the unease curling in her stomach. "Barbaric." Daniel snorted. "It worked." She didn't argue. She couldn't. Instead, she pulled her son closer and listened to the crackling fire, pretending it was the only warmth she felt. The shelter was close now, just beyond the next ridge. Lyrian's legs ached, her steps slow and heavy, but she forced herself forward. The weight of her son in her arms was both a burden and a lifeline, proof that she had to keep moving, that she had to survive. Daniel walked ahead, his pace steady, unaffected by the cold in a way that frustrated her. Humans weren't built for this kind of climate, yet he moved through the storm like he belonged to it. Every now and then he glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "We're almost there," he said, raising his voice over the wind. "Just a little further." Lyrian said nothing. She had stopped wasting energy on conversation hours ago. The structure came into view as they reached the crest of the ridge, a low, half-buried building, its metal walls worn and rusted from time and weather. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Daniel led them inside, shoving the frozen door open with his shoulder. The air inside was thick with dust and the lingering scent of old machinery. Snow had crept in through cracks in the walls, forming small drifts in the corners. But it was dry. More importantly, it was out of the wind. Lyrian sank to the ground, her back against the cold metal wall. The moment she stopped moving, exhaustion crashed into her like a tidal wave. Her arms ached from carrying her son, but she couldn't bring herself to let go of him just yet. Daniel moved quickly, setting his pack down and clearing space for a fire. He retrieved a bundle of kindling and a fire starter, striking it with practiced efficiency. Sparks caught, flames flickered to life, and warmth slowly spread through the room. Lyrian let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her son stirred, his small green fingers curling into the thick fabric of Daniel's coat. His eyes fluttered open, hazy with exhaustion. "Mama, warm?" Lyrian pressed a hand against his forehead. "Still too cold, but better than before." "Yes," she murmured. Daniel watched her, his expression unreadable. "You should eat," he said finally, reaching into his pack and pulling out a ration bar. He tossed it to her without ceremony. Lyrian hesitated before taking it. The food was dense, packed with nutrients, but foreign. She had no choice but to trust that it wouldn't harm her. She broke off a small piece, pressing it against her son's lips. He accepted it sleepily, chewing slowly, before drifting back into an exhausted sleep. Lyrian took a bite herself, forcing it down despite the dryness. Her body needed it, even if her mind resisted. Across from her, Daniel leaned back against the wall, stretching out his legs with an ease that irritated her. How could he be so relaxed? They were still in danger. She was still in danger. "You didn't ask," she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Daniel raised a brow. "Didn't ask what?" "Why I was out there. Why I was left to die." He was silent for a moment, then shrugged. "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to." She hadn't expected that. Most people, Vance, humans, it didn't matter, always wanted to know, always wanted to dig into things that weren't theirs to uncover. But Daniel just waited, as if her past didn't change anything for him. She stared into the fire, watching the flames curl and dance. The words came slower than she expected. "My people were bound by biology, neural compression reinforced by chemical compatibility. Once bonded, two become one." Her voice was steady, but the weight of the truth pressed down on her. "When one dies, the other follows. It's always been that way." Daniel frowned. That's messed up." Lyrian's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not a belief. It's nature. At least, that's what we were told." Daniel didn't respond right away. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. Finally, he asked, "Did you love him?" The question caught her off guard. She should have been angry, should have snapped at him for asking something so personal, but the truth was she didn't know the answer. "I was chosen for him," she said slowly. "We were a match. What we had wasn't love. It was something else, something predetermined." Daniel's expression shifted, though she couldn't quite read it. "Sounds like you never had a choice." A bitter laugh escaped her. Choice was never part of it. She wasn't sure why she was telling him this. Maybe it was the fire, the exhaustion, or the way he listened without judgment. Or maybe it was because, for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to explain herself. A shiver ran through her, the last remnants of the cold still clinging to her skin. She rubbed her arms, but it did little to help. Daniel let out a low sigh and grabbed something from his pack, a blanket, thick and well-worn. He tossed it toward her. She caught it reflexively, fingers tightening around the fabric. "Take it," he said. "You're still freezing." She hesitated. Accepting help from him felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. But her body ached with exhaustion, and the cold was relentless. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, avoiding his gaze. "Thank you," she muttered. Daniel only nodded. He didn't gloat, didn't press. He just leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, as if the conversation had never happened. Lyrium watched him for a long moment. She had spent her life being told that humans were dangerous, that they were violent and cruel, ruled by primitive instincts. But this one had saved her, had fed her, had given her warmth without asking for anything in return. She looked down at her hands, her fingers still stiff from the cold. She rubbed them together, trying to summon heat that no longer existed in her body. Then, without a word, Daniel reached over and took her hands in his. Lyrian inhaled sharply, instinct telling her to pull away, but she didn't. His hands were rough, calloused, larger than hers, but they were warm, steady. He held hers gently between his own, rubbing slow circles against her frozen skin, coaxing life back into her fingers. A lump formed in her throat. It was such a simple thing. No expectation, no demand, just warmth, freely given. She looked up at him, and for the first time she saw something beyond the human she had been taught to fear. He wasn't a brute. He wasn't a mindless warrior. He was just a man. And for the first time since she had been cast away from her people, she didn't feel completely alone. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in silence. Inside the shelter, the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the cold metal walls. The scent of melted snow and lingering smoke filled the air, mixing with something else, something quieter, something neither of them wanted to name. Lyrian sat near the fire, her son curled against her, his small body rising and falling in deep, steady sleep. He had warmed considerably in the last few hours, his green skin no longer tinged with the dull gray of the cold. She ran her fingers gently through his dark hair, a habit from when he was smaller, when she had been certain she could protect him from everything. But she hadn't protected him from this. She glanced up at the man across from her. Daniel sat with his back against the wall, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate movements, the way he always did when his thoughts were elsewhere. His presence still unsettled her, not because she feared him, but because she didn't. She should. She should fear his strength, his unpredictability, the way he moved through this frozen world like he was made for it. But instead, all she could think about was the way he had given them warmth without hesitation, the way he had fought for them, the way, right now, he looked up from his blade and met her gaze with something she couldn't quite name. A long silence stretched between them before Daniel finally broke it. "You never told me your name." Lyrian blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. She hesitated, the instinct to guard herself still strong, still ingrained. But what was the point? He had already seen her at her weakest. He had carried her son when she could not. He had sat with her in silence when there was nothing left to say. "Lyrian." The word felt strange coming from her own lips, as if she had forgotten how to say it. How long had it been since someone had spoken her name without judgment, without the weight of exile attached to it? Daniel nodded slightly, like he was turning the sound of it over in his mind, testing how it fit. "And him?" He tilted his head toward the boy sleeping in her lap. Lyrian looked down at her son, the most fragile thing she had ever known, and yet the reason she was still breathing. She brushed a strand of hair from his face. "Soray." Daniel was quiet for a moment, as if committing both names to memory. Then, to her surprise, he gave her something in return. "Daniel?" She looked at him sharply. He smirked, just a little. "Figured it's only fair." Lyrian didn't know why that made something tighten in her chest. She exhaled slowly, shifting Soray's weight in her lap. "I wasn't meant to be here," she admitted. the words slipping out before she could stop them. My people. When we bond, it's not just emotional, it's biological, neural compression reinforced by chemical compatibility. She kept her eyes on the fire. When one dies, the other follows. It's always been that way. Daniel's brow furrowed. That's a messed up way to live. Lyrian almost laughed. Almost. It's not a belief, it's nature. Or at least, that's what we were told. The fire crackled between them. Daniel's expression darkened. So, when your mate died, they expected you to die too. Yes, but you didn't? No. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. And they exiled you for it. She nodded. They thought something was wrong with me, that my bond was weak, that I was unnatural. The word tasted bitter. I thought so too, for a long time. Daniel studied her, his gaze steady, unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. It's not how love works. Lyrian's breath caught. Love. She had never used that word before. Not for what she had with her mate. Not for the thing that had been decided for her, written into her biology before she ever had a choice. She had been taught that her bond was unbreakable, that the chemicals in her blood would dictate her feelings, would make them real. But if that had been true, she would have died with him. Instead, she had lived. Not because she loved him, but because she didn't. The fire flickered between them, but it was no longer the only warmth in the room. Daniel shifted slightly, resting his arms on his knees. Sounds like you never had a choice, he murmured. A humorless smile tugged at Lyrian's lips. Choice was never part of it. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Yeah, well, maybe it should have been. She didn't know how to respond to that. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what she felt. Or of what she didn't. A shiver ran through her, though this time it wasn't from the cold. Daniel noticed immediately. Without hesitation, he reached for his pack, pulling out another blanket. He hesitated only briefly before leaning forward and draping it around her shoulders himself. His fingers brushed her collarbone as he adjusted the fabric, a fleeting touch, warm despite the cold. Lyrian inhaled sharply. She should have pulled away, she didn't. Daniel didn't move, his hands still resting lightly against her shoulders. He was close now, close enough that she could see the roughness of his skin, the way the firelight cast shadows along his face. For a moment neither of them spoke, and then slowly he lifted a hand and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Her pulse stuttered. She didn't know what startled her more, that he had done it, or that she had let him. Daniel's gaze flickered to hers, searching. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. Her throat felt tight, her chest too full. She had spent her entire life believing that love was something predetermined, something decided by biology. But this was different. This was something real, something she had never been given the chance to choose. And for the first time, she thought, maybe she would. The first sign of danger was the sound. A low mechanical hum that barely registered beneath the howling wind. At first, Lyrian thought it was her imagination, just the storm shifting across the ice, playing tricks on her exhausted mind. But then Daniel tensed beside her, head tilting slightly, his expression sharpening. He heard it too. She turned toward the sound just as the sky split open with piercing white light. The deep, resonant hum of thrusters filled the air, growing louder as a sleek silver vessel descended from the darkness, its metallic hull gleaming against the frozen landscape. Her breath caught in her throat. They had found her. Instinct took over. She grabbed Sore, pulling him close as a wave of panic surged through her body. Daniel was already moving, rising to his feet with practiced ease, his hand going to his weapon. His gaze flicked toward her. Friends of yours. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Lyrian's stomach twisted. No, The ship landed smoothly, a testament to Varan engineering. It was small, not a warship, but it didn't need to be. Varan enforcers weren't soldiers. They were something far more efficient. Executioners, who never carried weapons because they never needed them. A sharp hiss cut through the night as the landing ramp extended. From the ship's cold interior, figures emerged, their long cloaks rippling in the icy wind. Their presence was like a wound against the frozen wasteland, too precise, too controlled, untouched by the elements that had nearly killed her. Lyrian recognized them immediately. They weren't here to negotiate. Daniel stood firm beside her, his stance shifting slightly, a predator sizing up the threat before him. He didn't reach for his knife yet, but she could feel the tension rolling off him, coiling just beneath the surface. The lead enforcer stepped forward, his silver eyes assessing her with cool detachment. His face was familiar, one of the Elder's emissaries. A man who had once spoken her fate as if it were nothing more than an administrative detail. "You are difficult to find," he said smoothly. Lyrian swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "You shouldn't have come." He ignored the statement. His gaze flicked to Soraya, still bundled against her chest. His expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his posture, a quiet calculation. "You know why we are here?" She did. Lyrian had never been meant to survive. When her mate had died, she was supposed to have followed. That was the way of their people, the unbreakable law written into their very biology. The fact that she hadn't, that she had lived, made her an anomaly, a threat. And threats were not allowed to exist. "We assumed you perished in the storm," the enforcer continued, tilting his head slightly. "It seems we were mistaken." Lyrian tightened her hold on Sorai, instinct screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. "We're not going back," she said. The enforcer's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "You misunderstand. You were never meant to return." A slow, crawling cold spread through her chest. Daniel took a single step forward, his presence like a wall between her and the enforcers. "You want to explain what the hell that means?" The lead enforcer barely glanced at him, his gaze flicking over Daniel like he wasn't worth acknowledgement. He exhaled softly, as if indulging a lesser being. "She is an error in our system," he said, "an error that must be corrected." Lyrian's pulse pounded in her ears. They weren't here to take her back. They were here to erase her. She had expected this moment, deep down. She had known from the second she defied the natural order that her people would never let her exist, but knowing didn't make it easier. Daniel shifted again, his stance no longer merely defensive but poised for something more. "You're saying you came all this way just to kill her?" There was something lethal in his voice now, something quiet and dangerous. The enforcer studied him for a moment before giving a slow nod. "Correct." The word barely left his lips before Daniel moved. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the enforcer by the front of his cloak, yanking him forward and slamming him against the hull of the ship with enough force to crack the ice beneath them. The other enforcers stiffened, but none of them moved. "Yet. You're not taking them." Daniel's voice was low, steady, but beneath it was something far more dangerous than anger. It was certainty. The enforcer remained eerily calm, despite the blade now resting just below his throat. "Step aside." Daniel pressed the knife in just slightly, not enough to break skin, but enough to be a warning. Not gonna happen. A flicker of something passed through the enforcer's silver eyes. Not fear, but something close. Confusion. He had expected submission. He had expected inevitability. He had underestimated what humans were willing to do for the people they cared about. Lyrian couldn't breathe. She should tell Daniel to stop. She should de-escalate before this turned into something worse. But she didn't, because for the first time in her life, someone was fighting for her. Not because they were bound by biology, not because they had been programmed to, because they chose to. The fire crackled weakly in the distance. barely holding on against the night. The enforcer sighed, glancing toward his subordinates. "Stand down." The other enforcers hesitated. Then, one by one, they lowered their hands. Daniel didn't move. His blade remained where it was. "Let him go," Lyrian said softly. A long pause. Then Daniel exhaled sharply and released his grip, stepping back. The enforcer straightened, adjusting his cloak with careful precision. He met Lyrian's gaze, his expression unreadable. "You will not be pursued again," he said. "As far as our people are concerned, you no longer exist." Lyrian felt something deep inside her crack open. She had thought she would feel relief when this moment came, but instead all she felt was the weight of finality. She had been erased. The enforcers turned, retreating up the ramp without another word. The others followed, their movements silent and controlled. A moment later, the ship's thrusters roared back to life, and then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, they were gone. The silence they left behind was suffocating. Lyrian let out a slow, shaky breath. Daniel turned to her, his gaze sharp. "Are you okay?" She looked down at Sore, still safe in her arms, then at Daniel, standing there like an immovable force between her and the rest of the universe. She swallowed hard. "I think I am." She wasn't sure if it was the truth, but for the first time she wanted it to be. The wind had died, but the silence it left behind was worse. Lyrian stood frozen. Soria clutched against her chest, her heart beat a frantic drum against her ribs. The bodies of the raiders lay still in the snow, their blood seeping into the ice, dark and glistening beneath the pale glow of the twin moons. And Daniel was still standing, but just barely. His knife slipped from his fingers, landing soundlessly in the snow. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, and when he swayed, Lyrian lurched forward before she even realized she was moving. She caught him just as his legs buckled, lowering him carefully onto the frozen ground. His weight was heavy against her, his body unnaturally warm despite the frigid air. Lyrian's fingers found the wound at his side, sticky with fresh blood. Too much blood. Her throat tightened. "You're an idiot." Daniel huffed out a weak laugh. "Not the first time I've heard that today." She pressed harder against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. "Stay awake." His lips curled slightly. "Why? You worried about me?" "Yes." She didn't say it. She couldn't. Instead, she scowled, reaching for the torn remnants of her cloak. "You're not dying here, Daniel." His gaze flickered up to hers, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "You only use my name when you're serious." "I am serious." He let out a breath, less of a laugh this time and more of a sigh. His hand lifted, brushing against her wrist, just barely, just enough for her to feel the roughness of his skin, the warmth beneath the cold. "Lyrian?" His voice was quieter now, softer. "We won." She shook her head. "Not yet." He exhaled again, eyes fluttering closed for half a second too long. Panic surged through her. She grabbed his face, forcing his gaze back to hers. "Stay with me," she ordered. His eyes opened, hazy but still focused. "Bossy," he muttered, but there was no real fight in the words. Lyrian pressed a makeshift bandage to his side, ignoring the way her hands trembled. "You really don't know when to shut up, do you?" Daniel smirked, or at least tried to. "Nope." She swallowed against the tightness in her chest, against the fear threatening to swallow her whole. She had nearly lost him, and the realization of it was unbearable. "Lyrian," he murmured again, his voice rougher now, weaker. She met his gaze, and something shifted between them. The world had always told her what love was supposed to be, biological, chemical, an inevitability. But this was something else entirely. Something chosen. Daniel's fingers found her wrist again, this time curling around it, anchoring himself to her. She shuddered at the warmth of his touch, at the way it sent something unfamiliar through her veins, something raw, terrifying, and completely real. Her breath hitched when his thumb traced slow, deliberate circles against her skin. He was studying her now, searching her face like he was looking for something. "You're shaken," he murmured. "So are you," she countered, voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled, his hand moving up her arm, trailing warmth in its wake. "Lyrian." She didn't stop him. Didn't pull away when his fingers slid up to cup her cheek, when his thumb brushed against the corner of her lips. She had never been touched like this before, never been allowed to want it. But she did. Desperately. She leaned in before she could stop herself, her breath mingling with his, the space between them vanishing. Their foreheads touched first, then their noses. Then, finally, his lips. It was tentative at first, soft, cautious, as if giving her the chance to stop, to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she pressed closer, her fingers tangling in the fabric of his coat, pulling him to her. Daniel let out a low, shuddering breath against her mouth before kissing her deeper, slower, like he had been waiting for this. Like he had been waiting for her. Lyrian wasn't sure how long they stayed like that, tangled in warmth despite the cold, in something fragile yet unbreakable. But when they finally broke apart, Daniel smiled. Small, tired, but real. And Lyrian knew, without a doubt, that she had made her choice. The night was eerily silent. The bodies of the raiders lay motionless in the snow, their blood dark against the ice, already beginning to freeze beneath the cold grip of the wind. The battle was over, the danger had passed, but Lyrian couldn't move, because Daniel was still bleeding. She pressed a trembling hand against his wound, feeling the warmth of his blood seeping through her fingers, staining the fabric of his coat. He sat against a jagged slab of ice, his breathing uneven, his face paler than she had ever seen it. For the first time since she had met him, he looked fragile. That terrified her. "Stay awake," she ordered, pressing down harder. Daniel let out a sharp breath, but the smirk he gave her was still there. Still him. "I don't know. Bossy Lyrian is kind of growing on me." She scowled. "This isn't funny." "Feels pretty funny." He winced but somehow managed to chuckle. "Like someone shoving a knife in my side. Oh, wait." She glared at him. "I swear, if you die on me after everything, I will—" "What, kill me?" He let his head rest back against the ice, smirking up at her despite the pain in his eyes. "Bit redundant, don't you think?" Lyrian's throat tightened. He was joking. Because that's what Daniel did. He laughed in the face of danger, smirked at death. But this time she could see the exhaustion creeping into his body, the weight of his injuries dragging him down. He was losing too much blood. And she wasn't sure how to stop it. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the bandages, trying to secure them as tightly as possible. His body was warm beneath her touch, too warm, fever already setting in. "This isn't working," she whispered, frustration thick in her voice. Daniel studied her, his gaze softer now. "You're s—" She froze. She swallowed. "Of course I'm scared." "You're bleeding out in the middle of nowhere, and I don't have a way to stop it." He hummed, something dangerously close to amusement in his voice. "So you do care." Lyrian sucked in a sharp breath, her hands stilling against his side. "Daniel." He blinked at her, the teasing fading slightly at the way she said his name. There was no anger in her voice this time, no exasperation. Just raw, unfiltered fear. And something else, something she wasn't ready to name. She exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around his coat. "You can't die." His expression softened further. "I wasn't planning on it." "That's not what I—" She closed her eyes, inhaling slowly, then met his gaze again, this time without hesitation. "You can't die. I won't let you." For once, Daniel didn't have a smart remark. Instead, he reached up, his hand rough and calloused, and cupped her cheek. Lyrian froze. His thumb traced along her skin, a slow, deliberate motion that sent warmth curling through her, pushing back the cold that had settled in her bones. His touch was gentle despite everything, despite the fight, despite the pain. Despite the fact that he was the one bleeding out, he still comforted her. Her breath hitched. She had spent her whole life believing that love was something predetermined, something dictated by biology and chemistry, that it was something that happened to you, not something you chose. But this moment, this feeling, was entirely hers. There was no bond forcing her toward him, no neural connection making her feel this way. She chose him, and she would keep choosing him. Daniel's fingers moved, slipping into her hair, tangling there as he pulled her closer, not forcefully, never forcefully, just enough to let her know that he wanted this, that he wanted her. And she didn't pull away. Didn't stop herself when she leaned in, when her forehead brushed against his, when their breaths mingled in the cold. His lips were chapped, rough but warm when they finally met hers. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first, as if neither of them quite believed this was real. But when Lyrian's fingers tightened in his coat, pulling him closer, Daniel responded instantly, tilting his head to deepen the kiss. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, uneven, both of them too exhausted, too caught in the weight of everything that had happened. But it was real. And when they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingling in the frigid air, Daniel let out a quiet chuckle. "So, does this mean you like me?" Lyrian groaned, dropping her forehead against his shoulder. "You ruin everything." He grinned. "Not everything." She huffed, but she didn't move away, didn't let go. For the first time since she had been exiled, since she had been cast out into the cold to die, she didn't feel alone. She had fought to survive. And now, for the first time, she wanted to live. The fire crackled softly, its golden glow casting flickering shadows against the shelter's walls. The storm had long passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unreal after everything they had been through. The air inside was warm, carrying the faint scent of smoke and melting ice. Lyrian sat close to Daniel, her fingers resting lightly against his bandaged side. He was healing, slowly, stubbornly, as he always did. The makeshift wraps were still stained with dried blood, but the worst of the danger had passed. His body was warm beneath her touch, solid and alive. Alive. The words settled deep in her chest, a quiet relief she hadn't let herself feel until now. Across from them, Sore was curled up in the thick folds of Daniel's coat, his small green fingers clutching the fabric like it was the safest thing in the world. His steady, even breathing filled the silence, and every now and then he let out a soft sigh, shifting slightly in his sleep. Lyrian ran a gentle hand through his dark hair, brushing it back from his forehead. He had been quiet since the fight, clinging to her with a silent understanding that things had changed. But tonight he had finally fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. For the first time in too long, her son felt safe. She exhaled slowly, her fingers still absently tracing over Daniel's side. He was watching her now, his gaze softer than she had ever seen it. "You should rest," he murmured. Lyrian shook her head. "I can't." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Still worried about me?" She huffed, not quite able to bite back a smile. "You have a talent for getting yourself nearly killed." His lips twitched. "And yet, here I am." She gave him a pointed look. "Barely." His smirk softened, and without thinking he reached up, brushing his fingers along her jaw. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent warmth curling through her all the same. Her heart stumbled. Daniel's hand slid up, his thumb tracing just beneath her cheekbone, slow and deliberate. "You never told me," he murmured. Lyrian swallowed. "Told you what?" His fingers brushed against her temple, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "If you were going to kill me yourself." She blinked, confused for half a second before realizing what he was referring to, the words she had spat at him earlier in the fight. "If you die on me, I will kill you myself." Heat crept up her neck. "You were being an idiot." He hummed, amused. "And now?" She held his gaze, her fingers tightening slightly where they rested against him. "Now?" She hesitated, her pulse thrumming loud in her ears. Now she couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't here. Now the thought of losing him made her chest ache in a way she had never known before. Now there was no denying what she had been too afraid to name. Daniel's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, something quiet and waiting. He was giving her space, giving her time. But she didn't want time anymore. Larian leaned in before she could second-guess herself, closing the space between them. His breath hitched just before their lips met. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, but when her fingers slid up to tangle in the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, Daniel responded in kind. His good arm wrapped around her, anchoring her against him, his lips parting just enough to let her deepen the kiss. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't desperate. It was a promise, one made in silence, with nothing but warmth and the quiet certainty of what had always been growing between them. When they finally pulled away, their breaths mingling in the space between them, Daniel exhaled a quiet chuckle. "So," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers, "I'm taking this as confirmation that you do like me." Larian rolled her eyes, but she didn't pull away. "I swear, you ruin everything." He grinned. "Not everything." A sleepy mumble from across the fire made them both turn. Saray shifted, rubbing at his eyes as he slowly blinked awake. His violet gaze flickered between them, still hazy with sleep, before a wide, drowsy smile stretched across his small face. "Mama? Happy?" he mumbled. Larian inhaled sharply. Her son had seen too much, felt too much fear for someone so small. He had clung to her through every storm, through every night spent in the cold, through every uncertainty of whether they would live to see another sunrise. And yet here he was, asking if she was happy. She swallowed the lump in her throat and leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "Yes," she whispered, "I'm happy." Saray made a content little sound before curling deeper into Daniel's coat, already drifting back to sleep. Larian exhaled, her heart impossibly full. Daniel was watching her again, his gaze softer than she had ever seen. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. She could feel it. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. For the first time, she had something more than just survival. She had them, and she would never let go.